So some new reaction now from the White House moments ago as the president faces increasing criticism today over his decision to go ahead with an economic speech that included a blistering criticism yesterday of Republicans. Now, the president launched the political attack as he stood literally inside of 2 miles away from what was going on the left-hand side of your screen. And it just had a lot of people shaking their heads about timing and whether or not the president has a tin ear, because the manhunt at that point, we thought there still might be 2 people out there with guns. That was still underway. Residents were under shelter-in-place orders in many parts of the city. Hundreds of Navy Yard employees were still being evacuated at that point. The bodies of some of the victims were still laying inside the buildings as they went to do this speech. So just a few minutes ago, Jay Carney was asked about this, and he responded to the questions about the president's timing, and here's what he said.
Jay, I know Ed asked this yesterday, but you've had a day to reflect. Still a good idea for the president to give what was a very partisan speech yesterday, even after what happened over at the Navy Yard?
Look, I understand some Republicans are trying to make something of this. The president spoke about the Navy Yard at the very top of his briefing. He talked about the cowardly act that had taken place, the tragedy that was unfolding, and the loss of life. And he called for and demanded a seamless investigation, but with federal and local law enforcement officials, and that is what we're seeing now. It is a fact that we have very little time for Congress to act, and the consequences for the American economy of Congress failing to act would be significant.
All right, let's put that question to the panel. Joining me now, Bernard Whitman, a former pollster for former President Bill Clinton and a Democratic strategist. David Webb is with us as well, host of the David Webb Show on SiriusXM's Patriot Channel, Tea Party 365 co-founder and a Fox News contributor. You have a lot of titles. And Doug Schoen is also with us, former advisor to President Clinton and a Fox News contributor. Gentlemen, welcome, first of all.
Thank you.
And before we get underway, I do want to play a little bit from last night of Charles Krauthammer and Brit Hume on this, and then we'll jump in. Let's play that.
The president in that speech was back to hyper-partisan mode, slashing attack on Republicans. I thought was an extremely bad taste. He could have waited until tomorrow. It isn't as if this is a holy anniversary. He could have spoken, later in the week.
This president tends to engage in partisan attacks from the platform at the White House more than any president I can ever remember. Usually when a president does it, it's vague. You speak of those who this or some who say and all that. He's talking about the party, and he attacks the Republican Party with regularity. I don't think it's particularly attractive.
All right, let's go around the horn. Bernard, let's start with you.
I think it was a terrible tragedy that happened yesterday, and clearly the president expressed condolences on behalf of the nation. I think it underscores the terrible toll that gun violence has. Every day in this country, almost 100 people are killed by gun violence, 200 people injured. We've had almost 200 mass shootings in the last 7 years. But unfortunately, we've got a lot of serious issues to deal with, and I think the president was fair in raising concern because the media in our culture tends to obsess. All the coverage yesterday was about the Navy Yard, and understandably so. The previous weeks was all about Syria. There's been very little attention paid to the fiscal crisis that we're about to hit. And the government is going to hit its debt ceiling in a few weeks, run out of money a few weeks later. And if we don't get negotiations started, we are going to run into the exact same problem that we saw before, which was the nation's credit being downgraded and risking an economic recovery. And the fact that some Republicans say it was a partisan outburst, he is simply trying to get Speaker Boehner to understand he's got to get his conference in line and get the Tea Party extremists who seem intent on defunding Obamacare.
And he made all of those issues. He made all of those points in the speech. Doug, you worked in the White House.
I did.
What would you have advised in this situation?
Well, I would have advised a very different tone, not only given the tragedy at the Navy Yard, but there's a more general and I think larger point than Bernard is making. We need not hyper-partisanship on either side. We need to get together to deal with our challenges, because ultimately we're all Americans. We're facing the debt ceiling, the budget, Syria. These are all American challenges, particularly when the nation is put at risk given gun violence. Can't we come together and talk about our fiscal challenges, our overseas challenges as one nation, having different perspectives to be sure, but we have to come to consensus. That's what troubles me, Martha.
What we have here is a president who, like many other politicians, is a politician. And politicians don't have a tin ear to the American people. They have a politician's ear, which means when it serves their purpose, they will speak as needed. This was bad optics. It's not good for a president, doesn't matter right or left in this moment. Whether it's the cancellation of the Latin event later on that evening, my question would be why it took so long to lower the flags to half-mast in the evening when we had an 8 a.m. basically start to this event. So what we have here is Bernard deflects to gun violence and all these issues. These things are playing out, and early reports are often confusing. But when a president sets a tone, he sets a tone for the nation to follow. We have families that have just lost loved ones. You focus on that. You can reschedule the speech. You can do other things. That's not partisan. That's just, are you the president of the United States?
You know, I think, and I've asked this question before about the president. This is a second-term president. You know, he's not running again. And he does default often to this partisan kind of language. And I think, you know, when you look at this, even from the most political perspective, Bernard, yesterday was a moment to be president, to say, none of this matters right now. Let's take a moment and let's reflect on what's happened here and, you know, and then move on. There's nothing I can't say today that I can't say tomorrow morning. In fact, when you look at the speech, he had said almost everything in it before. So what was the urgency? As Jay Carney says, we have very little time.
Well, we do have very little time, and I think that the president did express appropriate condolences at the start of his speech. But the fact is, we have a month to get this solved. The two parties could not be further apart. And frankly, Boehner can talk as much as he'd like about the need for bipartisanship. And I echo Doug's sentiment. We need bipartisan approaches, comprehensive approaches, both on reducing gun violence and ending that epidemic in this country, and in coming to an agreement over the fiscal crisis and the debt ceiling and how we're going to fund the government. But the fact is, the Speaker cannot control his conference, and so the president does not have a party with which to negotiate.
What elements is the president willing to negotiate on?
Yeah, what elements is considered
in terms of, because this is all about spending cuts. I mean, this comes down to an agreement to raise the debt ceiling in return for real spending cuts.
There's a simple statement by the president that answers Bernard's questions. He will not compromise on the debt ceiling. Now, how do you negotiate when you say you will not compromise? Bernard likes to throw the slings out there, but let's take the president at his own words yesterday. If he will not compromise, Bernard, you cannot have a debate on the issues. Stop throwing out the extremists. Here's the reality. We have a month to solve a problem that's been around for a year. We have a president that is now pivoting for the 21st time yesterday on the economy. In fact, he's pirouetting like a ballerina, and he's come up with a plan. He's come up with no plan on this issue.
There are real issues on both sides. David, you're right. The president's not compromising enough. Should get everybody in a room and deal with it. But when we have the Tea Party extremists, as Bernard alludes to, wanting to shut down the government because we allegedly should not fund legislation that's already been passed, David, that's equally wrong. David, you have to listen. You have to listen. You're doing what John Boehner and his Republican colleagues do. Talk, not listen.
But Doug, with all due respect, find me the one Republican on the record who has said we want to shut down government. You will not find any. We're talking about having
look at Mike Lee and Ted Cruz.
The attempt to defund Obamacare is effectively a cry to shut down the government.
We can handle this issue, but we have got to reach a point and change course in this country. We're $87 trillion plus in long-term unfunded liabilities as of now. We don't have that much money, America.
The debt ceiling is money that has already been spent.
We will be right back.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen.